praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. And he spake also this parable unto them. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit thereon and found none. Then he said to the dresser of the vineyard, Behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why cumbereth it the ground? Then he answered and said, Lord, let it alone this year, that I may it round about and dung it, and if it shall produce fruit, well, and if not, then afterwards thou shalt cut it down. So then he entered into one of the synagogues on the Sabbath day and taught. And so here in the still early parts of the 13th chapter of Luke, we just saw where he opened up when they told him of the Galileans whose pilot blood had mingled with their sacrifices. And, he showed unto them, unless they repent, they shall all likewise perish. Him showing unto them even the 18 in Siloam upon whom the tower fell, asking if in both these cases, do you think that these people were extremely, sinners above the all others, letting them know that unless they repent, they shall all likewise perish. So here we have this parable, and parables, is his thing. It's really shown when he has, spoken a lot and wants to drive the point home, even further. I believe that these parables, they add such a emotional content, onto this thing. It sticks in better. You get the lesson. It's disarming, so that he can speak to the person who he needs to speak to. Usually the leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, chief priests, elders, and the Sadducees, who had such a huge ego, and anytime he would say anything to them, they would lash out on him. So this parable is story time, and they get to put their feet up and relax and listen to this thing. And then at the end, they can realize that it's them. So now this one is a fairly, popular parable. Maybe not so much parable as maybe the others, like the seed of the sower and, some other ones I could name. So, the whole understanding of this is that something is expected from us. I said it in a previous video, how we come here and, we know that we have free will. We have a right to live. We have a right to pursue happiness. We have a right to, not be harmed, not to be taken advantage of, to be defrauded. We have a right to say what and who we allow in our lives. We have the right to privacy. We have the right to free will and free choice. And, it's hard to tell, some people that, something is, being required of them. That, God, he has a measuring stick, because then, this would seem to violate our free will. How dare you tell me that you're expecting this from me? What if I don't want to give this thing? What if I don't want to be a part of this thing? What if I think this thing is ludicrous and I want nothing to do with it? Who tell you that you can come and impose this on me? What if I don't want to participate in this? Do I have a free, will, and choice, to do this thing? You have to understand that, this is how, life is. I think that if we were, grounded and our fundamentals, we were, shown these things and they were given to us at the beginning, where we would have lived our life, understanding this, it would have been, maybe easier to receive. It would have been better. But, we're all dropped off on this planet. We don't have a instruction manual. But, understand, these are the secrets of the kingdom of God. And, at the end of the day, nobody wants to hear depart from me. I would say even the most hardened sinner, even a criminal, that when they stand before God, they're not going to want to hear depart from me. I don't care how hardened they are, how tough. And even if some of them will, be fine with being told, depart from me, that place of torment, right? The dark, the heat, the things that they do to you in there, you get a very clear mind after suffering things like that. So I believe that nobody, wants to be told depart from me, no matter how tough they might act. But at the same time, he's given, these secrets. He's showing, I think that, sometimes we take things for granted. Sometimes we hear things and we don't, know how deep they go. We don't know how serious they are. In Jamaica, we have a saying that, you love to take, serious things and make jokes out of. You love to take serious things and make joke out of them. Because at the end of the day, you're gonna want to get a well done from him. At least he's telling you this way. When he said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," what does he mean by that? It's things like this. He's not here, because he has nothing better to do. He's not here to waste his own time. He's not here, trying to sabotage anybody. Make them do anything that they don't want to do. He's not here to fight anybody. He's not, coming here for jokes and laugh. He's not here to waste time. He's here to show us these things. And when he says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," it's not an idle statement. He's not, telling you things how he wishes they would be, or what you think you want to hear. He's not making things up. He's showing you the bottom line, the bare bottom line of what it takes. He's showing you the bare bottom line of what's going on. So it's in these parables that he adds another dimension of explanation onto what's going on. So like I said, overall, this shows us that something is expected of us. Now, I think that we have this drive, to want unconditional love. That people should just love you just because you are you. Now, that is true for the mother to the child. I think even in romantic relationships, there's an exchange of value. And sometimes when you stop providing that, the love it stops. Well, we think we would just want God to love us for us, and He does. But you have to understand that there's something going on. There's a thing that we are born into to be a part of. Instead of asking, why do I have to be a part of this? Understanding that we were born into this, and He's giving us the instructions. So we see Him saying how He spake this parable unto them, how a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and how he came seeking fruit thereon and found none. So we see that he didn't plant this tree; he had it planted in his vineyard. That's the first thing to notice. And later we're gonna see that there's a steward, a groundkeeper. So no doubt, the groundkeeper, he was the one, responsible for maintaining this. He probably was the one that planted it. So that we can get an understanding that this man is our Lord. And being the Lord that He is, He is going to have a certain standard. He's going to have a certain expectations. He looks as a Lord. He looks at things, Him being over them. And a thing about lords, they don't hesitate about cutting what needs to be cut off. As you'll see, that's the first thing He's gonna say. Cut it off. You have to understand, the mind of a lord, how they think, how they look at things. What is profitable, what is not. They're just concerned about their gain and their returns. Because this Lord, He has servants to pay. That's another thing you're looking at. You want to look at Him a certain way. What happens if He can't pay you? And this is how He gets His money. It's not going to be so funny when you joke the whole thing out and then now He has nothing to pay you with. I'm pretty sure you're going to have something to say even then. So He had this fig tree planted. We know there's another parable where He came and it wasn't a parable. It was something that happened. How it was early in the morning and He was hungry. They were coming from they went overnight, and I guess they spent the night there, and then they were coming back to the city, and then He saw the fig tree, and then He cursed it, and then the next time they saw it, it withered away. So now here's the parable that goes with it. So these are two different things. This parable that's being said about this man in theory, and then Jesus Himself did curse a fig tree. So the fig tree is you can ask the question, why? Why do they love to use the fig tree? Why is this such a popular tree for Him? He just said, men of thorns do not gather figs, neither of a bush gather they grapes. So, Jesus, He has a thing about the fig tree. And, I'm sorry I can't give an answer why, but it's, I'm going to be on the lookout to find out, why. Someday I'll be able to tell you why. Why does He love the fig tree so much? I believe that when Adam and Eve sinned, he sowed, leaves of figs. It was figs that He used to cover them. And we know that with the fig tree, it said that the fruit comes before the leaves. So with every other plant, usually you get the leaves first. Where I work at Roosevelt Island, you'll see the squirrels and their nuts. Right now, the winter is the trees are starting to come back and they're full of leaves but no nuts. And if you understand how plants work, right, it's the leaves that make the things for the fruit, and then it gets transported to the leaves. They have a big part to do with that, making the sucrose. So one thing I guess why He chooses the fig tree is because it's it works reverse to other trees. It stands out so much because it gets the fruit first and then the leaves after, and that's why He cursed it. Because when He got there, the leaves were there but no figs, which means that the figs were supposed to have been even there before the leaves. And I had an epiphany, what if somebody did come right before He did and took all the figs? And that's why there's none. You can blame that on that person who took all those figs, right? So a certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard. So now we know that, vineyards are usually associated with grapes, which, ties up perfectly with the parable I said earlier, how men of thorns do not gather figs, neither of a bramble bush gather they grapes, right? He said that right after He had just chosen the 12 apostles. That's all the way back in like chapter 6, I believe, or 7. So we have a fig tree being planted in a vineyard. Now, we know that sometimes words are used loosely. Like, vineyard might just be plantation, for whatever, everything that's going on, it's just called a vineyard. But at the same time, a vineyard could be specifically used to refer to grapes. I guess, we're going to have to walk both sides, not knowing, exactly what this was to mean. So we're given that this, fig tree is planted in a vineyard. Now, a vineyard, I would imagine it's, idealized to grow grapes. Do grapes and figs, thrive in the same kind of environment? Is this a known thing? Because, that could be a answer why it's not producing. Do figs thrive where grapes, thrive? And like I said, if it's just a regular place and it's just called a vineyard, then we can't use that, reasoning. So He came there seeking fruit and found none. So, this Lord, being Lord, maybe over many other things, how selective, I think that's what I was trying to get to at earlier, how selective our Lord is, how they don't, struggle with making decisions like this. 'Cause, they're over so many things. They learn to make decisions and they learn to stick with these decisions and they learn to not feel sorry for things and hold on to things before they need to let it go. These are some selective people. So he came to this tree, seeking fruit, understanding that, even this fig tree works for him, just as these other servants do. And it's practical. We're not here because we're friends. These servants that he has, they're not there because they're his friends. They're there because they work for him. And the same thing with this tree. So rightly so, he came seeking fruit. And we see how then he said unto the vine dresser, the dresser of the vineyard, behold, I come these 3 years seeking fruit on this tree and find none. Cut it down. Why cumber it the ground? So now he's, speaking to this keeper of the vine, of the vineyard. So now this is the planter. This is the man that maybe waters it. He monitors it to see if, any pests are eating, what they shouldn't be eating. If anything needs to be adjusted, anything needs to be added, anything needs to be done, is it thriving or not? So this man, he is over this thing. And, does he himself not consider these 3 years how this thing has not produced? Did it produce while the Lord was away? And then, he came back and then it was all gone. Has he been, eating these, figs, right? So, this 3 years is suspicious because, even the keeper would have known something is up. So he explains, this unto this keeper that, lo, I come here 3 years seeking, fruit on this fig tree and find none. So, we've seen him patient. 3 years is a long time. Season after season after season, I think maybe he was coming from a place where, these things, they're all his and it's beautiful to look at, and it gives him a sense of self-satisfaction. Look at these things that are mine. That tree, that's mine. Produces or not, it's still mine. I think that this was what was happening at first, but then frustration set in, for whatever reason. So we see his selectivity, how he speaks unto this keeper. Cut it down. Why cumber it the ground? Why is it taking up space? It was put here for a certain purpose, and it's not living up to what it was put here for. Now, like I said, we are human beings and not animals. That people, they raise animals for meat, they raise animals for milk and for clothing and for every other thing that I can name, whatever products they use to make. And, this is understood and accepted among mankind. We know there are animal groups that protest, these things, happening to animals, right? But, in God's, sense, it's like we are raised like animals, expected to produce something. And this is what people can't receive because, we know that we're above these animals and that, you can't just do to human beings what you do to animals. And this principle, it, tramples upon this premise because now, you're telling me that if I don't produce, then, I'm going to be cut down. But, Jesus, like I said, he's telling you the truth. And, for you to be hard-headed and not want to listen or even consider, there's a day, that will come, then all you're going to be left with is regret. And you would have wished just for an opportunity to try again, a second chance. So we see his selectivity and decision making, not being afraid emotionally to lose this thing, not being afraid to distance himself from it. He's a Lord looking at, his returns, and if this Lord can be so selective with what is his, then how much more the God of all creation is, selective with what is his. So we see also the keeper, of the vine answering, giving a suggestion, let it alone 1 more year that I may dig it round about and dung it. So he has a suggestion, he's going to put this thing on trial here. And we see, increase in care and attention being given. Sometimes God, he will send so many warnings. And that's exactly what, he's doing compared to, what this keeper of the vine is doing. His warnings is the same thing, because, when God is getting frustrated and, he's giving you another chance, to get, to where you need to, it's the same thing. He said, give it another year so he can, dig round about it. So the digging round about, I think, that's used to, first of all, to isolate it, apart from anything that might be stealing what this plant is supposed to get. And at the same time, while isolate, moving the outside that would come in and try to steal its resources, in this digging around, he's gonna fill it with fertilizer and resources for its use. So this thing is being, put in like an incubator, like when you find animal eggs and they put it in an incubator, which is like if the mother was sitting on the egg. He's putting this thing in an incubator, essentially. So now, I'll ask the question, is he so, quick to suggest this because he has been the one stealing it? Is he the one, like I said earlier, is he the one that's eating all these figs? Are the figs being produced when this Lord, who's maybe so busy, having other vineyards and other, plantations and, animal raising, animal farm in other cities and villages that he goes all around, maybe the whole year. And it just happens to be it, brings in figs when he's always away. And then we see him continue talking, saying, if it bear fruit, yea, and if not, then you should cut it down. So, it's like what do we have to lose? Maybe it just needs a little help along. Sometimes we just need a little help. Sometimes, we just got knocked off or, the horse that we were riding and we just need a little help getting back up. So, the solution of this man, give it one more chance. So now what's not given is the Lord's answer, right? Did he say yes? Did he say no? He does have all right to say no. But this man, he's willing to put his, name on this thing to give it one more chance. And if it doesn't work, no loss. They're just gonna remove it and put something else there. They might put another fig tree there. They might plant something else. So then we see a setup for another story how he entered into the synagogue on one of the synagogues on the Sabbath and taught. So we know that he's always doing that, and no doubt he's gonna be healing on the way also. All right, so here we are in, like I said, still the early parts of the 13th chapter of Luke, where he started out saying, they were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said unto them, suppose ye that these Galileans were sinners above all other Galileans, because they suffered such things? I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. Or that 18 in Siloam, upon whom the tower fell and slew them, suppose ye that these men were sinners above all the men in Jerusalem? I tell you, nay, but except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. So we pick up right here where it says, and he spake also this parable unto them. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking figs, found none thereon. So like I said, we're still early in this chapter. So is there a connection between the first ones about the Galileans whose blood were mingled with sacrifice and the men up in Siloam upon whom the tower fell? Showing that anything can happen at any point. I would say maybe not, because it does say, and he spake also this parable unto them, which kind of, I would say it shows an interruption and not a continuing, of one idea or thought or principle. Because to go from saying, well, things happen in life and anything can happen at any point, and it's not because of how good or how bad you are, either brings these things on or prevents them from happening. To go from, well, no, something is being expected of you. Because, to say that, well, these Galileans, they were cumbering the ground, or those men, the 18 in Siloam, were they not producing what they were? There's no connection. So this is a new idea. So, like I said, he also spoke a parable unto them. He said, I'll open my mouth in parables. I will utter dark things that have been kept secret since the foundation of the world. And how, like I said, the parables are used to disarm. I've been so wrestling with this so far of how, how do you tell people that something is being expected from them? How do you tell people that they were sent here for a purpose and that God, he invested talents and abilities in them to send them here to change the world for the better? How do you tell people that they're wasting, what God sent them here to do, if they are of that kind of mind to not, go along with what he is, saying? Now we know that for the believers, it's no problem, right? We're not talking about them. We're talking about like the general mass. Who will have something to say when you even try and mention something like this to them? How they will defensive. They'll even, start rebelling, being unwilling to even consider. They'll even be insulted. That's what you believe. Why are you telling me something like this? How they'll separate themselves from it. Not understanding that this is truth. And the thing about the truth, it'll always be there. If you reject it, at some point, maybe way down when it's too late, you're gonna see that truth, and you're gonna have to deal with it and live with the consequences of that. So such a hard topic and issue, he's using symbolism, because now when he tells this story of the fig tree, you understand where this Lord is coming from. You understand what it means for him, looking at it from his perspective. And I think that's another thing, that we get stuck in our perspective and we are unable to see God's perspective. And even if you were to try to show someone, they would just get offended. They would come up with all these excuses and reasons. They would, insist on their independence and freedom. They would even say that this is trampling upon their rights. This is trampling upon your rights. But you have to understand, we have a God that judges. At the end of the day, we have a God that says, you go to heaven, you go to hell. We have a God that, he said, the meek shall inherit the earth, and how he shall remove all the violent and put them in a place of violence. How many have been left behind with nothing but weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. You have to understand, what's going on. And, you can either make it work for you or you can harden your heart, during the pandemic or any other time in history, whenever something happened. Those that were willing to, adapt and even come up with, novel concepts, how they thrived in what would have destroyed everybody else. And it's the same thing here because this is what's really going on. And you are willing to, adapt to this and live in this and thrive, then you're going to be good at the end of the day. But just like those who were hard-headed and unwilling to change and even unwilling to try to change or even come up with anything that they could do, how they fell and they suffered. So this part is meant to disarm and such a heavy topic. How do you tell, I keep saying it, how do you tell a person that God is expecting something from you? And that, just like this fig tree, I mean, who you going to complain to? You can't write no letter to the Supreme Court or the World Health Organization or any, body of human rights. No human rights group can help you when God puts you out and puts you in hell. Nobody can get you out of there. So he spake this parable also unto them. A certain man, this certain man is used to show a typical man that, you can't expect this from anybody in his position or a similar reaction. Across the board, it's going to be the same. So, who he is not so important, but this is what's expected. This is a standard. A certain man, he had this, fig tree planted in his vineyard. So now, like I said, this fig tree is being planted in a vineyard where they grow grapes. And he didn't plant it himself, but he had it planted. That just goes to show you the importance of this man. This is like one of those, if you ever had a job, how you see the bigger bosses come in their suits and ties. And when they walk through, there's just a different air about them. They don't show up there every day. They're not the one crunching numbers or flipping burgers or helping customers. They're not the ones doing the heavy lifting, the cleaning the bathrooms, restocking inventory, answering the phones. They're not the ones doing this. But they just they walk through and they look at everything and they see this, see what they want to change, what they want to bring in, what they want to remove, they look at it and see how they can expand or how they can, overhaul the whole thing. If you're looking to cut, labor, if they're downsizing, how they walk through these men. This Lord is kind of like that. You can see his importance. He just walks through and makes decisions and then that's it. And then, at the end of the day, his workers work and then he is the boss. And he gets the overflow of the wealth. They get paid their salary. The riches are his. So now this, fig tree inside a vineyard. I'm still, looking at that. Do figs look like, grapes? Did they just got done planting some grapes and the grapes, consumed everything that it needed. So now none was left for the figs. What did he say to the children of Israel? They shall plant their crops for 6 years. The 7th year they shall plant no crops, for it is a rest unto the land, a Sabbath. Even the land has a Sabbath. Every 7th year, no crops are to be planted. For stuff like this, right? How it needs time to replenish what was lost. With the rain, lightning, fixes, nitrogen into nitrates, and it gives it time to restock on what it needs. If you think about it, he described it as the land needs rest. Does the land more to replenish? And what is rest? Rest is replenishing what was lost, usually energy. So he came seeking fruit and found none. So he knew that he was investing in this thing for a while. He had maybe even plans for it. How disappointing is it to have plans for something and see it fall through? These things, they hurt. Relationships that end. The person who had the greatest plans for it, they hurt the most, right? The person that walked away selfishly, they don't feel anything. So he came seeking figs thereon and found none. It does not say if the leaves were there. Was this thing producing leaves? What is the degree of pathology on this plant, this fig tree? Is it producing leaves? I would imagine it was, or else it would have been mentioned. Does this master know the season of the figs? Because sometimes they won't know the super specific things, details like that. Maybe he came a month before or 2 months or whatever, or after even. Did he come at the wrong season? That's not being mentioned, so you would assume that is not the case. So when he came and he found none, this was a cause for concern for him. He was expecting, and we don't see the keeper of the vineyard telling him that it's not the season for the figs. What was the state of this tree? Was it withered? Was it looking, malnourished? Was it, stunted in growth? How many other things were surrounding this? Was it in a crowded area? How was the soil, right there? All right, so the next verse says, then he said to the keeper of the vine, behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. cut it down, why cumbereth it the ground? So now he's talking to this guy, and he's been keeping record 3 years. So he's at least that involved and paying attention, because he could have just easily walked past it and look at what was producing, and marveled at that, instead of looking at this. So the keeper, he's the one that's there every day. He's the one that knows the delicate details about all these things, these plants. Does he have animals also? What else is going on, in his, plantation, in his, land. So we see him, mentioning the period of time, 3 years. So, we know that this man, he's an investor, and he has patience, and he's probably been doing it for a while, because he knows that, when you, invest in something, you don't expect to get the return right away. So year after year after year, he had an investor's mind to not be so, anxious to receive the profits from this thing, but he was keeping an eye on it. So, he explains it to the vine dresser, how I come 3 years seeking fruit and find none. So cut it down, why cumber it the ground? All right, so he gave it his time and what he was expecting. When fig trees bloom for the first time and give figs, is it, within a year? Is there like a certain turnover point that has to be achieved before you can expect anything? Were there other fig trees producing? Was this the only fig tree and it was not? Were there others around that were giving fruit? So cut it down. Why is it taking up space? Like I said, this is God. Depending on how long you have been not producing, and especially how much was invested in you, is what is to take into consideration. Imagine being invested with one of the highest investments and you give nothing. How does that look? If you were to buy stocks and they didn't give you anything, and even they were falling and they were failing, right? How would you feel? How would you feel about those stocks? You would have nothing good to say, right? So the next verse says, but he answered and said unto him, Lord, let it alone this year also, that I may dig round it and dung it. So, this man being the keeper of the vineyard, I would say, how comes he doesn't have more to say? I would like to have heard more than this, from him. Having been there every day, season after season. I'm pretty sure that he can tell some things that others can't. He could have, said, well, it's the soil. Look at it. It needs this and that and that. He could have said, you came at the wrong season. He could have said, well, for some reason it just, never grew right. Look at the others. They grow different than this one. He could have said, so many things, being the expert that manages these plants all day. So let it alone one more year. I will dung it and, hedge it round about. And, for it to, wait 3 years, for him to take action. Is that not, some degree of negligence? If this thing was to have produced within the first year, and definitely by year two, did you not see that something needed to be done? Did you not see that this needed to be addressed? The master shouldn't have had to come and, audit this plant for you to, figure out you need to do something. We get, complacent in life sometimes. The house can be on fire and we're just in there sleeping the same way. So, how comes this, wine dresser didn't take diligence to do something to address this problem before 3 years? And like I said, I asked the question, is he, doing something? Is he eating these figs, or, is he asking for more time so that, he can now bring these figs onto the master instead of eating them himself? Knowing for sure that it's going to come. So he's going to, dig it roundabout to isolate it from the other plants, like I said, that's going to be stealing the nutrients, and then, infiltrate with, dung, which is like cow, dung, that's good for fertilizer. Any animal that eat plants, their feces is good for, fertilizer, because all they eat is, plants and grass and stuff like that. And their gut, and even things that live in their gut, they break it down, and it provides a source of, nutrients that is really good, for these plants. So we see him also saying, if it produce well, and if not, then thou shalt, cut it down. So having what do we have to do? It's come this far. It would take much more to plant another one and have it grow, and have to wait for it to grow, than to give this one time to produce. But then if it's not going to produce anyways, then that's just more time wasted. But you have enough going on, and this is not going to, set you back, that way. When God, like I said, he sends warnings, through different people, not just the church. One of your friends can, just say something out of the blue. You could be watching TV, somebody says something, even on the news. You could be listening to a song, and then you hear something. God is not limited in how he can speak to you. And listen to the language that's used. Cut it down. That sounds kind of violent, right? Kind of heavy. Ain't nothing pretty about that. Remove it. good riddance. That's it. No more for you. So the last verse says, so then he entered into one of the synagogues on the Sabbath and taught. So here we have a setting up for the next story that's going to be told. I'm Straw Greenhorn.